Chapter 1. This is the life you're practicing. Most people believe their real life hasn't started yet. They think they're still in a temporary phase, a holding pattern, a season that will eventually give way to something more intentional. They tell themselves this isn't the final version, just something they're doing for now. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never stop to consider. This is the life you're practicing. Every routine you repeat, every compromise you tolerate, every day you wake up and move through on autopilot. That repetition is not neutral, it's rehearsal. You are rehearsing a life whether you mean to or not. And the longer you rehearse something, the more permanent it becomes. Most people don't end up trapped in a life they hate. They end up stabilized inside a life they never questioned deeply enough. Now let's slow this down, because this idea is easy to hear and easy to dismiss. People think, yes, but I'll change later. Later feels real because it's vague. Vagueness is comforting. It allows hope without cost. But your nervous system doesn't understand later. It understands now and repeat. What you repeat becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes safe. What feels safe becomes permanent. This is how lives lock in without drama. No collapse, no crisis, no moment where everything goes wrong, just quiet repetition. Now let's talk about why this is so hard to see. Because from the inside, life feels busy. You're doing things. You're handling responsibilities. You're managing stress. Movement creates the illusion of progress. But movement without direction only deepens the groove you're already in. You're not standing still. You're reinforcing. Every day you live the same structure. You make it easier to live again tomorrow. That's not failure. That's how human beings work. But it means one very important thing. If you don't choose your life deliberately, your habits will choose it for you. And habits don't care about your dreams. They care about efficiency. Now let's talk about the story people tell themselves. They say, this isn't forever. But forever doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives one ordinary day at a time. Forever is built quietly. People assume permanence requires commitment. It doesn't. It requires repetition. You don't have to decide to stay the same forever. You just have to keep living the same way long enough. Now let's talk about identity. Identity is not what you think about yourself. It's what your life proves about you. If your days look the same year after year, your identity hardens around that pattern. Not consciously, subtly. You stop imagining radically different futures because they feel unrealistic. Not impossible, just unrealistic. That's a dangerous word. Unrealistic doesn't mean false. It means unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels unsafe. Now let's talk about comfort. Comfort is not pleasure. Comfort is predictability. Knowing what tomorrow will look like. Knowing what's expected of you. Knowing how much effort you'll need to give. Even unhappy routines can feel comforting if they're predictable. That's why people stay. Not because they love their lives, because they understand them. Understanding feels safer than hope. Now let's talk about time. Time doesn't push you. It doesn't warn you. It doesn't say, this is becoming permanent. It just passes, quietly. You don't feel the shift day to day. You feel it when you look back. That's when people say, I didn't realize I'd be here this long. They didn't decide to be. They practiced it. Now let's talk about responsibility again. Most people are responsible in all the wrong ways. They show up, they provide, they endure, but they never take responsibility for direction. Direction feels selfish. Direction feels risky. Direction feels disruptive. So they choose responsibility over alignment. And slowly, responsibility becomes a cage. Now let's talk about the thought that visits people late at night. The one they don't say out loud. This can't be it. That thought isn't ingratitude. It's awareness. And awareness is dangerous if ignored. Because awareness doesn't disappear. It waits. Now let's talk about what this chapter is really saying. You are not stuck. You are not failing. You are becoming very good at living the life you're already living. That's what practice does. And the longer you practice something, the harder it becomes to stop. Not because it's impossible, but because it feels normal. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why nothing collapses for most people, and why that's exactly what keeps them trapped. Chapter 2, Why Nothing Collapses, and That's the Problem. Most people expect change to come from collapse. They believe something dramatic has to happen first. A breaking point, a crisis, A moment where life becomes so unbearable that change is the only option left. They tell themselves, if it gets bad enough, I'll change. That belief is comforting because it means you don't have to act yet. You can wait for life to force you. But here's the truth most people never realize. For most lives, nothing ever collapses. And that's the problem. Life stays just manageable enough. Bills get paid. Routines hold. Responsibilities continue. You're not thriving, but you're surviving. And survival is incredibly stabilizing. Now let's slow this down. Because survival doesn't feel like danger. It feels like competence. You're handling things. You're coping. You're making it work. From the outside, it looks like stability. From the inside, it feels like effort without direction. But because nothing is falling apart, there's no urgency. Urgency is what creates movement. Without urgency, people adapt instead of change. Adaptation is powerful, but adaptation without intention locks patterns in place. Now let's talk about why collapse feels necessary. Collapse removes responsibility. When everything falls apart, you're forced to change. You don't have to decide. You don't have to risk choosing wrong. Life chooses for you. That's why people secretly wait for collapse. It absolves them of responsibility. But collapse rarely comes for people who are functional. It comes for people who are reckless, unlucky, or already on the edge. Most people are neither. They are careful, responsible, enduring. And endurance is dangerous when it replaces direction. Now let's talk about slow erosion. Instead of collapse, most lives erode. Energy erodes. Curiosity erodes. Hope erodes. Not dramatically, quietly. You don't notice it day to day. You notice it when something reminds you of who you used to be. A photo, an old idea, a memory of what you once wanted. And there's a dull ache, not grief, not anger, just recognition. Now let's talk about systems. Your life is a system. It has inputs. It has routines. It has rewards. Systems don't change because you want them to. They change when the structure changes. As long as the structure holds, the system continues. Most people don't change the structure. They adjust inside it. They cope better. They distract more. They rationalize longer. All of that keeps the system intact. Now let's talk about the myth of one day. One day is the most dangerous phrase in a tolerable life. One day I'll change. One day I'll decide. One day things will line up. One day feels responsible. It feels patient. But one day has no deadline. And without a deadline, nothing moves. Now let's talk about time again. Time does not pressure you. It accommodates you. It allows you to repeat today indefinitely until repetition hardens into permanence. Now let's talk about why people confuse effort with progress. Effort feels like forward motion. You're tired, you're busy, you're stressed. Stress feels productive, but stress without direction is just friction. It doesn't move you forward, it wears you down. Now let's talk about the people who eventually wake up. They don't wake up because something collapsed. They wake up because something crystallized. They see clearly that nothing is going to force change. They realize the life they're living is the life they're choosing by default. That realization is uncomfortable because default feels passive, but it's not. Default is a decision you don't admit you're making. Now let's talk about honesty. Ask yourself this quietly. If nothing collapses, if nothing forces you, if things stay fine, how long could you keep living this way? 5 years? 10? The rest of your life? That question isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to clarify. Now let's talk about the dangerous relief people feel. When they realize nothing is collapsing, they relax. They say, I guess this is okay. That relief is short-lived because deep down something knows. Okay is not enough, but okay is stable. And stability without alignment is how people disappear into their lives, not physically, internally. Now let's talk about what this chapter is really about. It's not telling you to blow your life up. It's telling you not to wait for destruction to justify change. You don't need permission from pain. You need honesty with yourself. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about why comfort is stronger than desire, and why wanting more is rarely enough to overcome what feels safe. Chapter 3. Comfort is stronger than desire. Most people believe desire is powerful. They think wanting something badly enough will eventually move them. They tell themselves, when I want it enough, I'll change. That belief feels hopeful. It also keeps people stuck because desire is not stronger than comfort. Comfort wins more often than people are willing to admit. Comfort doesn't shout. It whispers. It tells you things are manageable. It tells you today wasn't that bad. It tells you you can handle one more day like this. Desire, on the other hand, is loud at first and quiet later. It shows up in bursts. Late night thoughts, moments of frustration, brief clarity when something stirs inside you. Then life continues. Comfort steps back in. Now let's slow this down. Comfort is not happiness. Comfort is familiarity. Knowing what your days will look like. Knowing how much effort is required. Knowing how disappointed you'll be, and surviving it anyway. Even dissatisfaction becomes comfortable when it's predictable. That's why people stay in situations they don't like. They understand them. Understanding feels safer than uncertainty. Now let's talk about why desire fades. Desire is fueled by imagination. You imagine a different life, a different version of yourself, a future that feels lighter or more aligned. But imagination requires energy, and comfort drains it. When you're tired, stressed, or overloaded, imagination shrinks. You stop picturing better futures. You focus on getting through the day. Comfort thrives in survival mode. Desire dies there. Now let's talk about the lie people tell themselves. They say, I want more. Often, what they really mean is, I don't like how this feels. Those are not the same thing. Discomfort alone doesn't create movement. If it did, everyone would change easily. Movement requires discomfort plus willingness to leave what's familiar. That willingness is rare because familiarity feels like safety, even when it hurts. Now let's talk about routines. Routines are powerful. They reduce decision-making. They conserve energy. They create stability. But routines also lock behavior in place. When routines are misaligned, they still feel safe. You know how to survive them. That survival becomes comfortable. Now let's talk about emotional comfort. People don't just stay in familiar jobs or relationships. They stay in familiar emotions. Familiar stress, familiar disappointment, familiar frustration. Those emotions become part of identity. You learn how to function with them. Removing them would feel destabilizing, even if life improves. Now let's talk about why people fear peace. Peace is unfamiliar. For people who've lived in tension for a long time, peace feels strange. Quiet feels empty. Stillness feels suspicious. They don't trust it, so they recreate stress. Not consciously, automatically. Comfort includes emotional patterns, not just external ones. Now let's talk about desire again. Desire doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for moments of stillness. It shows up when distractions fade. Late at night, early in the morning, during transitions. Those moments are brief, and if you don't act on them, comfort absorbs them. Now let's talk about the dangerous belief that desire will eventually overpower comfort. It won't. Comfort is reinforced every day through repetition. Desire is not. Unless you act on desire, it weakens. Comfort strengthens. This is why people say things like, I don't know when I stopped wanting more. They didn't stop wanting. They stopped feeding it. Now let's talk about responsibility again. People pride themselves on being responsible. They show up. They provide. They endure. But responsibility can become a shield. It protects you from questioning whether what you're responsible for is right. You say, I have to do this. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's just familiar. Now let's talk about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to trade comfort for alignment. That trade is expensive. It costs certainty. It costs approval. It costs predictability. Most people are unwilling to pay that price, so they keep wanting without choosing. Now let's talk about the subtle grief this creates. Grief for the life you imagine. Grief for the version of yourself that feels distant. Grief for the courage you keep postponing. That grief doesn't explode, it settles. It becomes background sadness. Now let's talk about the truth underneath all of this. If desire were enough, you would have changed already. That's not an insult, it's clarity. Change requires something stronger than desire. It requires discomfort that outweighs comfort, or honesty that disrupts denial. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the trap of being responsible and how responsibility becomes the most socially acceptable way to avoid change. Chapter 4, The Trap of Being Responsible. Being responsible feels like virtue. It's praised, it's rewarded, it's respected. From a young age, you're taught that responsibility is the mark of maturity. You learn that showing up, keeping things together, and not causing problems makes you a good person. And for a long time, that's true. Responsibility builds structure, it builds trust, it builds stability. But responsibility has a shadow side. At some point, responsibility can stop being a strength and start becoming a trap. Not because responsibility is bad, but because it's easy to hide behind. Now let's slow this down. Most people who feel stuck don't feel reckless. They feel burdened. They're carrying obligations. They're meeting expectations. They're doing what needs to be done. From the outside, they look reliable. From the inside, they feel quietly boxed in. They tell themselves they can't change because other people depend on them. And often that's partly true, but only partly. Now let's talk about how responsibility turns into avoidance. Responsibility gives you a socially acceptable reason not to question your life. You say things like, I can't just leave. I have people counting on me. It wouldn't be fair. Those statements sound noble. And sometimes they are. But sometimes they're also a way to avoid admitting something uncomfortable. That you're afraid to disrupt the life you've built. That you're afraid to disappoint people. That you're afraid of what happens if you choose yourself. So you frame staying as responsibility. It feels better than calling it fear. Now let's talk about identity. When people build their identity around being responsible, they become indispensable. They become the reliable one, the stable one, the one who handles things. That identity feels solid. It also becomes heavy, because once people rely on you staying the same, changing feels selfish. You worry that choosing differently would hurt others. And that fear keeps you locked in place. Now let's talk about the quiet resentment that can grow here. Resentment doesn't always come from being treated unfairly. It often comes from choices you made that you no longer want to own. You stayed. You sacrificed. You endured. At first it felt right. Over time it started to feel compulsory. That's when resentment creeps in. You don't say it out loud. You just feel tired. Now let's talk about the danger of being praised for endurance. When people praise you for handling everything, they unintentionally encourage you to keep doing it. They don't see the cost. They just see the output. So you keep going. You tell yourself this is just how adulthood works, that life is supposed to feel heavy, but heaviness is not the same as meaning. Now let's talk about choice again. Being responsible does not mean abandoning choice, but many people confuse responsibility with obligation. Obligation feels fixed. Choice feels risky. So they cling to obligation. Now let's talk about the lie underneath all of this. The lie is that being responsible means never changing course. That once you've committed, you're no longer allowed to question. But that's not responsibility. That's rigidity. True responsibility includes responsibility to yourself, to your values, to your well-being, to the life you're actually living, not just maintaining. Ignoring that responsibility creates internal conflict, and internal conflict leaks into everything. Now let's talk about time again. Responsibility compounds. The longer you stay, the more invested you become. The more invested you become, the harder it feels to change. So people tell themselves they've gone too far to turn back. That belief is powerful and often false, but it feels true because of sunk cost. Now let's talk about honesty. Ask yourself this quietly. If no one else were affected, would you still choose this life? If the answer is no, something matters there. That doesn't mean you leave tomorrow. It means something is misaligned. Responsibility doesn't erase misalignment. It just masks it. Now let's talk about the moment people sense this truth. It usually comes when the praise stops feeling good, when being dependable feels empty, when you realize you're being thanked for maintaining a life that drains you. That moment is sobering. Now let's talk about what responsibility actually looks like when it's aligned. Aligned responsibility feels purposeful. It feels chosen. It feels heavy sometimes, but not suffocating. Misaligned responsibility feels endless. It feels obligatory. It feels like your life is no longer yours. That difference matters. Now let's talk about the cost of staying trapped here. The cost isn't that things fall apart. They don't. The cost is that nothing meaningful changes. You become very good at surviving a life you didn't choose consciously, and over time, that survival becomes your identity. Now let's talk about the question that changes things. It's not, am I being responsible? It's, what am I being responsible for? For appearances? For comfort? For avoiding discomfort? For maintaining expectations? Or for building a life that actually fits? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer, but it does demand honesty. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about when effort stops working and why trying harder often deepens the very patterns people are trying to escape. Chapter 5. When effort stops working. There is a moment that confuses people deeply, a moment when they realize they've been trying for a long time, and nothing has really changed. They're tired, they're stressed, they're doing their best, and yet their life looks mostly the same. That moment is dangerous because people draw the wrong conclusion from it. They think effort failed because they didn't give enough, so they try harder. That's how people get stuck. Effort doesn't stop working because you're lazy. It stops working because effort can't fix misalignment. You can put enormous effort into the wrong direction and only make yourself more exhausted. Now let's slow this down. Effort is powerful when it's pointed. But when effort is used to maintain something that doesn't fit, it becomes friction. You're not building, you're bracing. That's why people say things like, I don't know why I'm so tired all the time. They're tired because they're constantly resisting their own life. Now let's talk about the illusion effort creates. Effort feels virtuous. You're busy, you're pushing, you're sacrificing. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it feels like strain. Strain is not growth. Strain is tension without movement. Now let's talk about why effort is praised so heavily. Society rewards visible struggle. Working hard earns respect. Endurance earns approval. But effort alone doesn't ask the most important question. Is this actually where I'm supposed to be going? Effort skips that question. It assumes direction is already correct. Now let's talk about the people who break here. They don't break loudly. They break quietly. They stop imagining alternatives. They stop believing things can change. They accept fatigue as normal. This is when people say, this is just how life is. That sentence is a resignation, not a truth. Now let's talk about effort versus leverage. Effort multiplies what already exists. If your direction is right, effort compounds progress. If your direction is wrong, effort compounds exhaustion. That's why some people seem to work less and move more. They're not more disciplined, they're more aligned. Now let's talk about how people misuse discipline. Discipline is supposed to support direction, but many people use discipline to silence doubt. They tell themselves, just push through. Don't think about it. Stay focused. That works for a while, but suppressed doubt doesn't disappear. It leaks out as burnout, irritability, and numbness. Now let's talk about the breaking point. For some people, effort eventually collapses. They can't push anymore. They feel empty. They interpret this as weakness. It's not. It's information. It's your system telling you that force is being used where clarity is needed. Now let's talk about honesty again. Ask yourself this quietly. If effort were removed for a moment, if you stop pushing, if you stop forcing, would the life you're living still make sense? Or is effort the only thing holding it together? That question matters because a life that only works when you push constantly is not sustainable. Now let's talk about the fear of stopping. People are terrified to reduce effort. They think everything will collapse. Often, nothing collapses. What collapses is the illusion that effort was the solution. That illusion is painful to lose, but losing it creates space. Space for reassessment, space for choice, space for redirection. Now let's talk about the difference between quitting and stopping. Stopping effort is not quitting life. It's pausing force. Quitting avoids responsibility. Stopping creates clarity. Most people never stop. They keep pushing because stopping would force them to look. Now let's talk about the moment change becomes possible. Change becomes possible when you stop asking, how can I try harder? And start asking, why am I trying so hard to stay here? That question changes everything. It shifts the problem from performance to direction, and direction is something effort cannot solve. Now let's talk about the relief people feel when they realize this. Relief not because the answer is easy, but because the problem finally makes sense. You're not failing. You're not broken. You're not undisciplined. You're misaligned. And misalignment cannot be fixed with more effort. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how identity hardens over time and why waiting makes change feel harder with each passing year. Chapter 6, How Identity Hardens. Over time, identity doesn't change in big moments. It changes through repetition. What you do repeatedly becomes what you believe about yourself. And what you believe about yourself quietly limits what feels possible. Most people think identity is something they discover. It's not. It's something they practice. Every routine you repeat, every choice you default to, every compromise you accept teaches you who you are. Not intentionally, automatically. Now let's slow this down. When you live the same structure long enough, your nervous system adapts to it. The stress becomes familiar. The dissatisfaction becomes tolerable. The effort becomes normal. You stop noticing how much energy it takes just to stay where you are. This is how identity hardens, not because you decided this is who you are, but because this is who you've been practicing being. Now let's talk about imagination. Imagination is one of the first things identity restricts. Early in life, imagining different futures feels natural. Later, it starts to feel unrealistic. Not impossible, unrealistic. That word matters. Unrealistic doesn't mean false. It means unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels unsafe to an identity that's been reinforced for years. So imagination shrinks. Not because you don't want more, but because wanting more feels incompatible with who you become. Now let's talk about language. Listen to how people talk about themselves over time. I'm just not the kind of person who, that's not really me. I've always been like this. Those statements sound factual. They're not. They're summaries of repetition. They're conclusions drawn from habit. And once spoken often enough, they feel true. Identity loves consistency. It resists contradiction. Now let's talk about age. Age doesn't limit change. Identity does. But age reinforces identity. The longer you live one way, the more evidence your mind collects to support that identity. That evidence stacks. Even when it's outdated, even when it's incomplete, you start filtering the world through who you believe you are. Opportunities that don't match that belief feel irrelevant. Risk feels inappropriate. Change feels irresponsible. This is why people say, it's too late for me, even when it isn't. Now let's talk about comfort again. Comfort doesn't just stabilize routines. It stabilizes self-concept. You get used to seeing yourself as someone who tolerates, who copes, who endures, who manages. That self-image becomes familiar, even if it's painful. Changing it would require letting go of the identity you understand, and losing identity feels like losing ground. Now let's talk about why people resist hearing this. Because it sounds permanent, and permanence is frightening. But identity is not fixed, it's reinforced, which means it can be changed, but not quickly and not painlessly. Now let's talk about the cost of waiting one more year. One more year doesn't just pass. It reinforces. It adds another layer of evidence. Another round of, this is just how it is. Another season of delayed choice. That doesn't make change impossible. It makes it heavier. Now let's talk about the moment people feel this weight. It often comes when they try to imagine starting fresh. The idea feels exhausting, not because they're incapable, because their identity doesn't recognize that version of themselves anymore. This is when people say, I don't have it in me. What they mean is, I haven't practiced being that person. Now let's talk about the lie people tell themselves. They say they need motivation. They don't. They need exposure. Exposure to acting differently, exposure to small contradictions to identity. Identity doesn't change through thinking. It changes through evidence. Now let's talk about how identity actually softens, not through dramatic reinvention, but through small, repeated acts that contradict the old story, doing one thing differently, then again, not to prove anything, but to create new evidence. Identity updates slowly, but it does update. Now let's talk about hope, carefully. Hope is dangerous when it's abstract, but hope grounded in action is powerful. You don't need to believe you can change your whole life. You need to believe you can interrupt one pattern. That interruption creates space. Space creates possibility. Possibility creates momentum. Now let's talk about honesty again. Ask yourself this quietly. What kind of person are you becoming by default? Not who you want to be, who your days are shaping you into. That question is not meant to judge you. It's meant to wake you up, because identity hardens through neglect and softens through intention. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the fear of living differently and why fear grows louder right before change becomes real. Chapter 7, The Fear of Living Differently. Fear doesn't show up when you're stuck. It shows up when you're close. As long as you're repeating the same patterns, fear stays quiet. You might feel tired, bored, or dissatisfied, but you don't feel threatened. Threat appears when change becomes real. When a different life stops being an idea and starts becoming an option. That's when fear speaks up. Now let's slow this down. People think fear means something is wrong. They think fear is a warning sign. Sometimes it is, but often fear is simply the nervous system reacting to unfamiliar territory. Your nervous system doesn't evaluate whether something is good or bad. It evaluates whether something is known or unknown. Known feels safe, unknown feels dangerous, even if the unknown is objectively better. This is why people feel the most fear right before a breakthrough. Not because the path is wrong, because it's different. Now let's talk about the kind of fear people feel here. It's not panic, it's quieter. It sounds like doubt. It sounds like second guessing. It sounds like, maybe I should wait. This fear is persuasive because it feels reasonable. It doesn't scream, it negotiates. It says things like, let's think about this a little more. Now isn't the best time. You don't have to decide yet. Those thoughts feel protective. They're not malicious, they're just familiar. Now let's talk about why fear intensifies after clarity. Clarity removes ambiguity. Ambiguity is comforting because it delays commitment. Once clarity arrives, you can't pretend you don't know. And knowing creates pressure. Pressure to act, pressure to choose, pressure to change. Fear rises to relieve that pressure by slowing you down. Now let's talk about the body. Fear is not just mental, it's physical. Your heart rate changes, your breathing shifts, your muscles tighten. Your body prepares to protect you from uncertainty. It doesn't know the difference between a physical threat and an identity threat. Changing your life feels like an identity threat. Because it is. You're asking your system to let go of a familiar version of you. That feels like loss. Now let's talk about how people misread this moment. They think, if this were right, it would feel calm. That belief is dangerous. Calm comes later. Before calm comes exposure. Exposure feels raw. It feels unstable. People who expect calm too early turn back. Now let's talk about why fear feels louder the longer you've waited. The longer you've practiced one identity, the more foreign another feels. Change doesn't just require effort. It requires letting go of the version of yourself you understand. That loss is real, and fear is grief's close cousin. Now let's talk about the fear people don't admit. They're not afraid of failing. They're afraid of succeeding and having no excuse left. If you try and fail, you can retreat. If you succeed, you have to live with the consequences of choosing. That's a heavier responsibility. Now let's talk about the urge to self-sabotage. When fear rises, people unconsciously create reasons to stop. They get distracted, they start new plans, they complicate things. Not because they're lazy, because sabotage feels safer than commitment. Sabotage lets you stop without admitting fear. Now let's talk about courage again. Courage is not confidence. Confidence comes after repetition. Courage comes before it. Courage is acting while fear is present, not eliminating it. Now let's talk about the people who move forward. They don't feel less fear. They interpret it differently. They see fear as a sign that something important is happening. They don't obey it automatically. They pause. They breathe. They move anyway. Now let's talk about the cost of retreating here. When you turn back after clarity, something changes. You teach yourself that fear is in charge. That lesson sticks. Next time, fear arrives sooner, louder, more convincing. That's how people become risk-averse over time, not because life hurt them, because they trained avoidance. Now let's talk about staying. Staying doesn't mean forcing yourself through panic. It means not undoing your decision just to feel better. It means letting fear exist without reacting to it. Fear peaks, fear fades, fear adapts, if you stay long enough. Now let's talk about the quiet victory most people miss. The first time you move forward while afraid, something shifts. Not externally, internally. You realize fear didn't kill you. You realize you can survive uncertainty. That realization builds a new identity. Now let's talk about honesty again. Fear is not telling you to stop. It's telling you you're crossing a boundary. Boundaries are where growth happens. Now let's talk about what comes next. After fear peaks and passes, something else arrives. Not excitement, not certainty, stability. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the moment change feels too late and why that belief shows up right before people either settle permanently or finally move. Chapter 8. The moment change feels too late. There comes a moment when fear is no longer the loudest voice. Something else replaces it. Resignation. It sounds like realism. It says things like, "It would have been easier if I'd started earlier. I don't have the energy I used to. Things are more complicated now." This is the moment when change begins to feel inappropriate. Not impossible. Inappropriate. As if it belongs to a younger version of you. As if wanting something different now is naive. This is one of the most dangerous moments in a person's life because it feels calm. Now let's slow this down. The belief that it's too late rarely comes from logic. It comes from comparison. You compare where you are now to where you think you should have been. You remember who you were years ago, what you could have done then, how much easier it would have been. That comparison hurts. So instead of moving forward, you turn backward mentally. You replay the past, and the future shrinks. Now let's talk about time again. Time doesn't make change impossible. It makes it heavier, more invested, more layered, more emotionally complex. People confuse heaviness with impossibility. They say, "I can't start now," when what they mean is, starting now would require acknowledging how long I waited. That acknowledgement is painful because it comes with grief. Grief for lost years, grief for postponed courage, grief for the life that might have been. Most people would rather avoid that grief than risk change, so they tell themselves it's too late. Now let's talk about identity again. By this point, identity has solidified. You're used to seeing yourself a certain way. You know your limits, you know your role, you know what people expect from you. Living differently would disrupt that identity. It would force you to be a beginner again. Beginners feel exposed. And exposure feels humiliating when you're used to competence. So you stay where you're skilled, even if you're unfulfilled. Now let's talk about the lie hidden inside too late. The lie is that change only counts if it leads to a perfect outcome. People think, if I can't become who I wanted to be, what's the point? But change is not about becoming an ideal. It's about becoming more honest. Even small shifts matter. But when you believe it's too late, small shifts feel pointless. Now let's talk about dignity. People want to change with dignity. They don't want to look foolish. They don't want to struggle publicly. They don't want to admit regret. So they choose stability instead. Stability preserves dignity. Change threatens it. But dignity built on avoidance is fragile. It requires you to keep pretending. Now let's talk about the quiet sadness that lives here. It's not dramatic. It's a background ache, a sense that something important was missed. People rarely talk about this sadness. They normalize it. They say, that's just how life is. But that sadness is not universal. It's specific. It belongs to people who know they avoided something. Now let's talk about the moment that interrupts this belief. It's usually not inspiration, it's exhaustion. You get tired of carrying the weight of too late. You realize that staying the same doesn't protect you from regret. It just stretches it out. That realization is subtle, but it's powerful because it reframes the choice. The choice is no longer between change and comfort. It's between regret now and regret later. Now let's talk about honesty again. Ask yourself this quietly. If you stay exactly as you are, Will this regret get smaller, or will it get more familiar? That answer matters. Now let's talk about the people who move forward anyway. They don't feel young again. They don't feel fearless. They feel grounded. They accept the past without trying to erase it. They don't chase lost time. They use what remains. That use creates meaning. Now let's talk about time one last time in this chapter. Time doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for participation. Even late participation matters, not because it leads to the same outcome, but because it leads to honesty. And honesty restores self-respect. Now let's talk about what this chapter is really saying. It's too late is not a fact. It's a story people tell themselves to avoid grief. Grief is painful, but it's also cleansing. On the other side of grief is clarity, and clarity opens doors you didn't think were still there. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what it really costs to stay the same, and why the price of inaction keeps increasing quietly. Chapter 9, what it really costs to stay the same. Staying the same feels free. No risk, no disruption, no explanation required. That's the illusion. Staying the same is never free. It just charges quietly. Now let's slow this down. Most people think the cost of change is high, and it is. Change costs comfort. Change costs certainty. Change costs identity. Those costs are visible. They're immediate. They're emotional. They're hard to ignore. The cost of staying the same is invisible. At first, that's why people choose it. Now let's talk about how the cost accumulates. Each year you stay the same. You pay in small ways. You pay in energy. You wake up a little more tired. You recover a little slower. You need more distraction to feel okay. Not because life got harder, because your spirit got heavier. Now let's talk about attention. Staying the same costs attention. You think about what you're avoiding more than you realize. It shows up in daydreams, in irritation, in moments of numbness. Mental energy is spent managing dissatisfaction instead of building something new. That drain is subtle, but it's constant. Now let's talk about emotional range. When people stay the same for too long, their emotional range narrows. They don't feel extreme pain, but they also don't feel deep joy. Life becomes flat, predictable, safe. Flatness is dangerous because it's survivable. People can live in flatness indefinitely. Now let's talk about relationships. Staying the same costs intimacy. When you're not honest with yourself, it's hard to be honest with others. You hold parts back. You perform roles. You avoid conversations that might expose dissatisfaction. Over time, relationships become functional instead of alive. Not broken, just shallow. Now let's talk about growth. Growth requires tension. When you avoid change, tension disappears. So does growth. You stop learning. You stop stretching. You stop being surprised by yourself. You become very good at managing what you know and very uncomfortable with what you don't. Now let's talk about regret again. Regret doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates. It's built from 1,000 moments where you didn't choose, 1,000 small retreats, 1,000 delays, 1,000 compromises you didn't mean to make permanent. That accumulation becomes heavy. Now let's talk about the future cost. The longer you stay the same, the fewer options remain. Not because doors slam shut dramatically, because paths require momentum, and momentum fades when unused. This is how people wake up feeling trapped without remembering when the trap was built. Now let's talk about identity one more time. Staying the same doesn't preserve identity, it hardens it. You become the person who tolerates, who manages, who adapts. That identity becomes familiar, even when it hurts. Changing later means changing more. Now let's talk about the lie people tell themselves. They say, I'll change when it hurts enough, but staying the same numbs pain. It doesn't intensify it. That's why waiting rarely works. Pain doesn't spike, it spreads. Now let's talk about the cost people never calculate. The cost of staying the same is not that you'll hate your life, it's that you'll get used to it. And getting used to a misaligned life is the most expensive thing you can do. Because once you're used to it, change feels unnecessary, and unnecessary feels irresponsible. Now let's talk about honesty again. Ask yourself this quietly. If you do nothing differently for the next 5 years, what will that cost you? Not hypothetically, emotionally, energetically, relationally. That answer matters. Now let's talk about the moment people finally act. They don't act because the cost of change drops. They act because the cost of staying the same becomes undeniable. That moment doesn't feel dramatic. It feels clear. And clarity is powerful. Now let's talk about what this chapter is really saying. Staying the same is not neutral. It is an active choice with a compounding price. You pay in pieces of yourself you don't get back. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the last exit most people ignore and why it's available far longer than people think, but not forever. Chapter 10. The last exit most people ignore. Most people don't miss their chance because it disappears. They miss it because they stop recognizing it as a chance. They assume the last exit would be dramatic, a crisis, a breaking point, a moment that forces action. But the last exit is rarely loud. It's subtle. It shows up as a quiet realization that something inside you is no longer willing to pretend. Not angry, not desperate, just done. Now let's slow this down. The last exit doesn't arrive when everything falls apart. It arrives when everything keeps working. But you don't. You're functioning, you're coping, you're doing what's required. But something has shifted internally. You stop believing the story that this is temporary. That belief dissolves. And when it does, you see your life clearly. Not emotionally, structurally. You see that if nothing changes, this is it. That clarity is unsettling because it removes hope based on delay. Now let's talk about why people ignore this exit. Because it doesn't demand action, it invites it. And invitations are easy to decline, especially when declining looks like staying responsible. Now let's talk about what the exit actually is. It's not a specific opportunity, it's a mindset shift. You stop asking, how do I make this tolerable? You start asking, what would I choose if I stopped managing disappointment? That question is dangerous because it reframes everything. And now let's talk about fear again. At this point, fear changes. It's no longer fear of the unknown, it's fear of permanence. Fear that if you don't move now, you never will. That fear is quieter than panic, but heavier. Now let's talk about the temptation to rationalize. People say, I've made it this far. It would be selfish to disrupt things now. There's no guarantee change would be better. All of those are true, and none of them answer the real question. The real question is, can I keep living this way honestly? Not heroically, not optimistically, honestly. Now let's talk about why this is called the last exit. Because after this point, something settles. If you ignore this moment too many times, awareness dulls. You don't feel the tension as strongly. You normalize it. You stop expecting alignment. That's when people truly settle. Not consciously, internally. Now let's talk about the courage this moment requires. Not explosive courage, quiet courage. The courage to admit that effort won't fix this, that endurance won't transform this, that patience has become avoidance, that admission doesn't demand immediate change, but it demands truth. Now let's talk about the first step through the exit. It's not a leap, it's a stop. You stop pretending the dissatisfaction will resolve itself. You stop calling avoidance responsibility. You stop delaying clarity. Stopping changes posture. Now let's talk about how life responds. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly. When you stop lying to yourself, your choices change. Your tolerance shifts, your boundaries adjust, your energy reallocates. You don't overhaul your life, you reorient it. Now let's talk about what people expect on the other side. They expect excitement. What they get is steadiness, the relief of no longer negotiating with themselves all day. That relief is profound. Now let's talk about what this chapter is really about. The last exit is not about escaping your life. It's about reclaiming authorship, about choosing instead of drifting, about participating instead of enduring. Most people walk past this exit, not because it's closed, because it's quiet, and quiet things are easy to ignore. Bonus chapter next. In the final bonus chapter, we'll slow everything down and talk about the life you could still choose, not as fantasy, but as something grounded, realistic, and honest. Bonus chapter. The life you could still choose. There is a quiet misconception people carry. They believe that choosing a different life means erasing the one they've lived, as if change requires denial of the past. as if starting again means pretending nothing happened. It doesn't. The life you could still choose is not a replacement. It's a continuation, built with more honesty. Now let's slow this down. When people imagine change, they imagine extremes. Quitting everything, leaving everyone, starting from zero. That image is dramatic and unrealistic. Most real change doesn't look like escape. It looks like correction. Small intentional shifts that realign you with yourself. Now let's talk about what this life actually looks like. It's not perfect. It's not free of struggle. It's not endlessly exciting, but it fits. And fit changes everything. When your life fits, effort feels purposeful. Discomfort feels meaningful. Responsibility feels chosen. Now let's talk about the first thing that changes, not your circumstances, your relationship to truth. You stop pretending certain things don't matter. You stop minimizing your dissatisfaction. You stop explaining away your intuition. You listen more closely. That listening alone changes your behavior. Now let's talk about choice again. Choice doesn't arrive as certainty. It arrives as willingness. Willingness to take one step that contradicts the old pattern. That step doesn't have to be big. It just has to be honest. Now let's talk about honesty in practice. Honesty might look like admitting you're unhappy instead of coping, setting a boundary you've avoided, reducing effort where it's being wasted, stopping something you've been calling temporary. These are not dramatic acts. They are grounding ones. Now let's talk about fear again. Fear doesn't disappear when you choose differently, but it changes shape. It becomes less paralyzing, less persuasive, less personal. You stop interpreting fear as a verdict. You see it as adjustment. Now let's talk about patience. The life you could still choose unfolds slowly, not because it's fragile, because it's real. You don't rush it, you don't force it, you let it stabilize. Stability is underrated. Now let's talk about identity one last time. Identity doesn't need to be reinvented, it needs to be updated. You're not becoming someone new, you're becoming someone more accurate. That accuracy feels unfamiliar at first, but it feels relieving. Now let's talk about regret again. Choosing differently doesn't erase regret, it integrates it. Regret becomes information instead of weight. You stop fighting the past, you use it. Now let's talk about meaning. Meaning doesn't come from having the right life. It comes from participating honestly in the one you're building. Even small participation matters. Now let's talk about the moment people notice the shift. It's subtle. They realize they're no longer negotiating with themselves all day. The inner argument quiets. That quiet is powerful. Now let's talk about time one final time. Time doesn't ask you to start over. It asks you to start now, with what you know, with what you have, with who you are. That's enough. Now let's talk about the end. There is no final instruction here, no call to action, just a recognition. You don't need permission to choose your life. You never did. You only needed to stop pretending you didn't have a choice. That's the life you could still choose, and it's closer than you think. After everything has been said, there's usually a moment of quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, it feels exposed. This is the part most people never sit with. They rush past it. They distract themselves. They look for the next idea. But this quiet matters, because this is where truth settles. Not the kind of truth that motivates you, the kind that stays. Now let's slow down even more. When the noise stops, when the explanations end, when the language fades, what remains is awareness. Awareness of your life as it actually is. Not dramatized, not minimized, not improved in your imagination. Just real. This is uncomfortable for most people, because awareness removes the buffer. You can't hide behind plans. You can't hide behind effort. You can't hide behind one day. You're left with the shape of your days, and that shape tells a story. Now let's talk about the story most people avoid hearing. It's not that they failed, it's that they adapted. They adapted to disappointment. They adapted to misalignment. They adapted to lives that didn't quite fit. Adaptation is impressive. It's also dangerous. Because adaptation reduces urgency. Once you adapt, pain fades. Once pain fades, movement slows. Once movement slows, identity settles. This is how people quietly give up without deciding to. Now let's talk about the word forever. Forever isn't a promise. It's a direction without interruption. When people say, most people will live this life forever, they don't mean fate. They mean momentum. Momentum is powerful, and momentum doesn't care what you intended. It only cares what you repeat. Now let's talk about interruption. Change doesn't require reinvention. It requires interruption, interrupting a pattern, interrupting a reaction, interrupting a story you've been telling yourself. Most people think interruption has to be dramatic. It doesn't. It just has to be honest. Honest interruption looks like not numbing the discomfort tonight, not explaining it away, not postponing the question again. It looks like staying present with what you already know. Now let's talk about knowing. You don't need more information. You don't need more insight. You already know where your life feels misaligned. You already know what you've been avoiding. That knowing isn't loud, it's steady, and it's patient. It waits years if it has to. Now let's talk about patience. Patience is often praised, but patience without direction becomes delay, and delay repeated long enough becomes identity. Now let's talk about identity one final time. You are not defined by what you wanted. You are not defined by what you planned. You are not defined by what you meant to do. You are defined by what you practiced. That's not punishment. That's power, because practice can change, but only when you stop pretending it's temporary. Now let's talk about the smallest possible shift. Not a new life, not a bold declaration, not a dramatic break. Just one honest decision, one boundary you stop crossing, one truth you stop denying, one action you stop postponing. That's enough to interrupt momentum. An interruption is how forever changes. Now let's talk about what comes after interruption. Nothing spectacular. Life continues, but it continues differently, with less internal noise, with less self-negotiation, with more clarity about what you will and won't tolerate. That clarity is not exciting. It's grounding. And grounding is what makes change sustainable. Now let's talk about the listener. You. If you've made it this far, something in you is willing to listen longer than most people do. That doesn't make you special. It makes you honest. Honest enough to sit with discomfort. Honest enough to not rush resolution. Honest enough to let truth land slowly. That honesty matters. Now let's talk about the final truth of this audiobook. Nothing here asks you to become someone else. It asks you to stop abandoning who you already are, to stop living as if this is rehearsal, to stop treating your life like a draft, to stop assuming clarity will arrive later. Later is not guaranteed, but now is available, and now is enough. At some point, even reflection runs out of words. What remains is feeling, a weight in the chest, a tightness in the stomach, a sense of recognition that doesn't need explanation. This is the part people usually escape from. They turn on noise. They reach for distraction. They tell themselves they'll think about it later. But staying here, just a little longer, changes something. Now let's slow this even more. Truth doesn't rush. It doesn't argue. It doesn't convince. It doesn't persuade. It simply exists. And the longer you sit with it, the harder it becomes to pretend you don't see it. This is why silence is uncomfortable. Silence removes your defenses. In silence, you notice what your life actually feels like when you're not narrating it. Now let's talk about narration. People live inside stories. Stories about why things are the way they are. Stories about what they had to do. Stories about why they couldn't choose differently. These stories aren't lies. They're explanations. And explanations can become cages. Because as long as the explanation makes sense, nothing has to change. Silence interrupts explanation, and interruption reveals truth. Now let's talk about the body again. Your body knows before your mind admits. You feel heaviness when something is misaligned. You feel restlessness when something wants to move. You feel numbness when something has been suppressed too long. You don't need to interpret these sensations. You just need to notice them. Notice without fixing. Notice without judging. That noticing is rare and powerful. Now let's talk about why people rush transformation. They want relief. They want a plan. They want certainty. They want a way out of discomfort. But discomfort isn't always something to escape. Sometimes it's something to listen to. Listening doesn't require action yet. It requires presence. Now let's talk about presence. Presence is not focus. It's honesty without interference. It's allowing what's true to exist without immediately trying to change it. Most people never allow that. They skip straight from discomfort to distraction, or from insight to action. They never let truth fully land. Now let's talk about landing. When truth lands, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels settling, like something heavy finally being set down. You don't feel energized, you feel grounded. Grounding doesn't create excitement, it creates stability. And stability is what makes real change possible. Now let's talk about patience again. Not patient waiting, patient witnessing. Witnessing your patterns, witnessing your reactions, witnessing the moments you avoid. This witnessing changes behavior without force, because once you see something clearly, repeating it becomes harder. Not impossible, but harder. Now let's talk about the fear of staying here too long. People worry that if they sit with truth, they'll drown in it. They won't. Truth doesn't overwhelm. Resistance does. When you stop resisting, truth becomes manageable, even heavy truths. Now let's talk about responsibility one last time. Real responsibility isn't about fixing everything. It's about not turning away. Not turning away from what you know. Not turning away from what you feel. Not turning away from what your life is asking of you. You don't have to answer immediately, you just have to stay present. Now let's talk about the smallest movement that happens next. It's not a decision, it's a shift in tolerance. You tolerate less dishonesty, you tolerate less self-betrayal, you tolerate less delay, not aggressively, naturally. What no longer fits simply starts to feel heavier, and what feels heavier eventually gets put down. Now let's talk about trust, not trust in outcomes, trust in yourself. Trust that if you stay honest, your next step will reveal itself, not loudly, quietly. Now let's talk about the long view. This audiobook is not meant to end with motivation. It's meant to end with clarity that lingers. The kind of clarity that shows up days later, weeks later, in moments when you're about to default again. You'll remember this feeling, not the words, the feeling of knowing, and knowing changes things. Now let's talk about forever one final time. Forever is not decided in one moment. It's decided in thousands of small ones. Moments where you either turn toward truth or away from it. This moment counts, not because you'll do something dramatic, but because you stayed, you listened, you didn't rush. That alone separates you from most people, and separation creates possibility. Now let's stop here, not because there's nothing left to say, but because this part needs space. Let it sit, let it echo, let it work quietly. That's enough for now. There is a moment after awareness settles, a moment when you realize you've heard all of this before, not in these words, but in yourself. You've felt it in pauses, in hesitation, in the subtle resistance that shows up when you're about to do the same thing again. That realization doesn't come with urgency. It comes with familiarity, like recognizing a face you've seen many times but never named. Now let's slow down even more. Most people think the problem is not knowing what to do. It isn't. The problem is knowing and still not doing. That gap between knowing and doing is not laziness. It's loyalty. Loyalty to the life you've already built. Loyalty to the version of yourself people expect. Loyalty to patterns that once protected you. That loyalty makes sense. It kept you safe. It kept you functional. It kept you accepted. But safety can quietly become confinement. Now let's talk about loyalty honestly. You don't owe your future to your past. You don't owe consistency to a version of yourself that no longer fits. Growth requires breaking silent contracts, contracts you never signed, but kept anyway. Now let's talk about the contract you've been honoring. The contract that says don't disrupt, don't risk, don't want too much. That contract wasn't written in words. It was written in experience. Moments where choosing differently felt unsafe. Moments where staying quiet felt easier. Moments where endurance was rewarded. Those moments trained you, not maliciously, effectively. Now let's talk about training. You can't undo training with intention alone. You undo it with repetition in a new direction. That doesn't require confidence. It requires exposure. Exposure to choosing differently and surviving it. Now let's talk about survival again. You've survived everything so far. That fact is easy to overlook. You survived uncertainty. You survived disappointment. You survived staying too long. You will survive choosing differently too. But your nervous system doesn't know that yet. It needs evidence. Now let's talk about evidence. Evidence doesn't come from thinking. It comes from experience. One small experience at a time. You don't need to flip your life upside down. You need to introduce a contradiction, a moment where you act differently than you normally would. Not dramatically, deliberately. Now let's talk about deliberate action. Deliberate action is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't try to prove anything. It simply aligns behavior with truth. That alignment creates relief, not excitement, relief. Now let's talk about relief. Relief is underrated. Relief is the feeling of not lying to yourself anymore, of not carrying the tension of avoidance, of not rehearsing explanations for why you haven't changed. Relief is spacious, in spaces where possibility lives. Now let's talk about possibility carefully. Possibility is fragile. It doesn't like pressure. It doesn't like deadlines. It doesn't like expectations. Possibility grows in environments of honesty. When you stop pretending, when you stop rushing, when you stop forcing answers. Now let's talk about the next moment, not tomorrow, not next week. The next moment you're about to repeat something you know doesn't fit. That's where this work lives, not in big plans, in small recognitions. You'll feel it, a pause, a hesitation, a choice point. That's where change begins, not loudly, quietly. Now let's talk about why this audiobook doesn't end cleanly, because life doesn't. There is no resolution here, just an opening you can walk past or walk into. Either way, it remains. Now let's sit here a little longer. No instruction, no push, no conclusion, just awareness. Awareness of your breath, awareness of your body, awareness of the life you're living. Let that awareness do what it does best. Clarify.